For decades, it was a conflict fought in the shadows, with spies, cyber attacks, and proxy forces. But then, in 2026, it just exploded into open warfare, completely redrawing the map of the Middle East and sending shockwaves across the entire globe. In this explainer, we're going to unravel the incredibly complex history, the high-stakes gambles, and the chain of events that led to this historic confrontation.
For years, it was all about simmering tensions, these covert operations, and indirect fighting that really defined the conflict. But on this one date, everything reached a boiling point, triggering a direct, full-scale military confrontation between Iran, Israel, and the United States.
So, to really understand how we got here, we're going to break it all down into 6 key chapters. We'll start with the historical roots, then look at the proxy networks, the nuclear standoff, the final escalations, the economic fallout, and finally, the global entanglement. Okay, first things first, we have to go back in time. It might be pretty hard to imagine now, but Iran and Israel, they weren't always enemies. Actually, their relationship used to be the complete opposite of what it is today. So, before 1979, when the Shah was in power, Iran and Israel actually shared a close strategic partnership. It was this alliance of the periphery, you could call it, against Arab adversaries they both shared. But the 1979 Iranian Revolution, that was the absolute turning point. It established a fiercely anti-Western, anti-Israel Islamic republic, and everything changed. And this slide really just lays it all out, doesn't it? The reversal is just stark. What was once a strategic alliance became a completely severed relationship. Close cooperation devolved into what analysts call an existential enmity, where each country began to, and I quote, contest the other's moral right to exist. This ideological clash really became the bedrock for the decades-long shadow war that followed. All right, let's move on to the second key piece of this puzzle, the proxy war. For the better part of the last 40 years, this conflict wasn't fought head-to-head. Instead, it was fought through a whole network of allied militant groups that were funded, trained, and armed by Iran. And this network has a name, the Axis of Resistance. You can think of it as Iran's #1 tool for projecting its power across the region without having to get into a direct war between nations. Its main goal? To push back against American and Israeli influence on as many fronts as possible. As you can see here, this created a sort of ring of pressure. You've got Hezbollah on Israel's northern border, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, the Houthis down south threatening major shipping lanes, and militias in Syria and Iraq. This whole network allowed Iran to challenge its adversaries from multiple directions at once. But of all the tensions, one stood head and shoulders above the rest, raising the stakes to a truly existential level: Iran's nuclear program. This, right here, became the absolute heart of the standoff. At the center of all the international concern were sites like Fordo, which is hardened, built deep underground, and the huge Natanz complex. For years, these places were the focus of intense diplomacy, crippling sanctions, and, not to mention, repeated acts of sabotage and cyber warfare. And that leads us to the billion-dollar question, the one that drove decades of policy. Was Iran actually building a bomb? Well, Iran consistently said its program was just for peaceful energy production. But the international community, and especially Israel, was deeply afraid it was all a cover for developing nuclear weapons. This led Iran to develop a policy of, strategic ambiguity. Officially, a religious decree or a fatwa from the supreme leader forbade nuclear weapons. But officials also made it pretty clear that if the regime's very survival was on the line, that could change. And that posture, right there, just fueled incredible mistrust. Which brings us to the final rapid escalation. After years and years of shadowboxing, the fight started to move out into the open, with a series of events that really pushed both sides right past the point of no return. So in 2024, for the very first time, Iran and Israel got into direct, large-scale missile exchanges. That just shattered all the old rules. Then, in June 2025, there was a limited campaign called the 12-Day War, which saw the US and Israel hit some nuclear sites. But the decisive blow, that came on February 28, 2026. Operation Epic Fury was, it was completely unprecedented. A coordinated US-Israeli attack struck at the very heart of the Iranian regime. It killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the Minister of Defense, the head of the Revolutionary Guard, and dozens of other top leaders in what you'd call a decapitation strike. Iran's response was massive. and it was immediate. In just the first few days, it launched over 500 missiles and 2,000 drones, a barrage of more than 2,500 projectiles. And they weren't just targeting Israel, but also U.S. bases and allies all across the Gulf. The Shadow War was officially over. Now, a conflict like this doesn't stay regional for long. It almost immediately kicked off a global economic crisis, and it was all centered on the world's most critical artery for oil. I mean, just look at the sheer scale of this disruption. The Strait of Hormuz, which carries about a fifth of the entire world's oil supply, was effectively shut down. The flow dropped from 20 million barrels a day to basically a trickle, creating the largest single oil supply disruption in history. And the impact on energy prices, it was instantaneous. Brent crude oil, that's the global benchmark, it skyrocketed from around $75 a barrel to a peak of nearly $120. And that, of course, fanned the flames of inflation in every single corner of the world. And that brings us to our final chapter, the war's ripple effects. Everything from geopolitical realignments to the truly tragic human cost of the conflict. This war forced nations everywhere to take sides. The US and Israel were, of course, the main combatants. But for the very first time, Iran directly attacked Gulf states like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, completely shattering years of effort to de-escalate tensions. And all the while, a power like China had to balance its extreme vulnerability to energy prices with the strategic benefit of seeing the US tangled up in another Middle East war. And behind all the strategy and all the geopolitics, the human cost was immediate. Early reports from neutral sources showed hundreds killed in Iran, casualties in Israel from missile strikes, injuries to U.S. personnel at bases in the region, and civilian deaths in the UAE. These are not just numbers. They represent the devastating toll of this new era of open conflict. So, when you step back and look at the whole picture, the 2026 war wasn't the result of just a single event. It was the violent endpoint of a reversed history, a sprawling proxy network, a high-stakes nuclear gamble, and economic warfare, all of it just colliding at once. Understanding all of these interconnected layers is, for sure, the essential first step. But it also leaves us with the most urgent question of all. With the old order completely shattered and the rules of engagement rewritten in fire, what on earth comes next for the Middle East and for the world?
好，我们来想象一下，一个酝酿很久的区域冲突，在短短几个小时之内就引爆成一场全球性的危机。这就是2026年的伊朗战争。接下来，我们会带你深入这场冲突的核心，从导火线到全球性的影响，一步一步把整个事件的全貌给说清楚。就是这一天，2026年2月28日。这一天，整个中东的火药库可以说是被彻底引爆了。一场闷烧很久的区域冲突正式升级，变成一场全面性的高强度战争。这场战争的开头真的可以说是超级戏剧化。美国和以色列他们联手发动了一个代号叫做“史诗怒火”的军事行动。你看，他们目标非常非常明确，在一次斩首突袭里面，伊朗的最高领袖哈米尼当场遇刺身亡。哇，那伊朗的反应呢，也是一样又快又猛，数百枚的飞弹跟无人机就这样铺天盖地呼啸而出，整个中东一瞬间就被战火给吞没了。不过，一场规模这么大的战争，绝对不是一天两天就打起来的。所以你可能会想问，到底是发生了什么事，一步一步把双方推到战争的悬崖边呢？好，让我们把时间稍微往前倒，来看看这场冲突是怎么酝酿的。从这个时间轴上，我们其实就可以看出来，整个局势是在短短1年多的时间里，可以说是急转直下。你看，2024年底。联合国的报告先敲响了警钟，说伊朗的铀浓缩活动已经快要到武器级了。然后时间快转到2026年初，伊朗国内爆发了大规模的抗议，结果却遭到血腥镇压。最后的最后，当2月中旬的核谈判宣告破裂的时候，战争的脚步声好像就已经在门口了。在谈判桌上，两边都画了下了自己完全不能退让的红线。 美国的态度非常硬，就是说，伊朗你必须彻底放弃核武，把所有相关的设施通通拆掉。那伊朗这边呢，也毫不示弱，他们要求美国要给出白纸黑字、有法律效力的永久保证，不能再像以前一样说退出就退出。就是这样，双方谁也不让谁，外交的这扇门就这样砰一声被彻底关上了。
那压垮骆驼的最后一根稻草是什么呢？很可能就是2026年1月这场大规模的抗议。你想想看，在美国和以色列的这些战略家眼里，伊朗政府用这么残酷的手段去镇压，这恰恰就暴露了他内部的脆弱。他们就觉得，一个千载难逢的机会之窗好像出现了，是时候给伊朗政权来个致命一击了。
好，所以当外交手段走到尽头，战火就变得无可避免了。接下来，我们把视线转到战场上，来看看双方在这场高科技战争里面是怎么展开激烈攻防的呢？美以联军的空袭其实就像一场非常精密的外科手术，他们的目标就是要彻底地瘫痪伊朗整个战争机器。你看，从天上的防空系统到地底下那些很坚固的飞弹发射井，从海上的军舰到那些躲起来的指挥中心，全部通通都在他们的打击范围之内。不过，面对这种攻击，伊朗可没有坐以待毙，他们的报复来得又快又猛。数百枚的飞弹跟无人机就像是复仇的怒火一样，不只射向以色列，更席卷了整个中东地区的美军基地跟他们的盟友。这就等于是在宣告说，这场战争绝对不会是单方面的屠杀。从这张图表，我们就可以很清楚地看到伊朗反击的范围到底有多广。你看看，从以色列到波斯湾沿岸的这些国家，几乎所有美国的盟友都成了目标。这也代表着战火已经彻底失控，蔓延到整个中东地区了。战争最残酷的一面，永远是这些冰冷的伤亡数字。根据人权组织的初步估计，光是第一波的空袭，就在伊朗境内造成了超过2400人死亡。每一个数字的背后，都是一个破碎的家庭。而且战火的蔓延也点燃了黎巴嫩这个早就已经很脆弱的火药桶。随着真主党的介入，冲突变得更复杂，也迫使将近70万人逃离家园，变成了无家可归的难民。所以说，这真的不是一场局部冲突。空袭警报可以说是响彻了伊朗的大部分领土，全国31个省份里面有高达26个都遭到轰炸。这意味着对伊朗人民来说，这是一场根本无处可躲的全国性战争。中东的战火很快就烧到了全世界。你可能会觉得奇怪，这场看起来是区域性的冲突，是怎么引发一场全球性的经济风暴呢？关键字就在于能源。伊朗的反击不只是在军事层面，他们打出了一张王牌，全面封锁荷默兹海峡。这个您可能觉得听起来没什么的海峡，却是全球石油运输的命脉。所以伊朗这个举动就等于是掐住了全球经济的咽喉。这个数字或许能让你更直接地感受到它的重要性。全球每5桶石油里面就有1桶必须要从这里经过，20%，你想想看这个比例，情况到底有多严重？国际能源署，也就是 IEA， 他们给出了一个很吓人的警告。他们说，世界正面临有史以来最大的全球能源安全挑战。这句话让很多人想起了上个世纪70年代那场几乎瘫痪全球经济的石油危机。这种全球性的危机很快就反映在我们每个人的生活里了。我们来看看德国的例子，战争爆发后短短10天，加油站的油价就一路往上飙。这就告诉我们，不管你住在哪里，你都没办法置身事外。战争总会有结束的一天，但它留下来的却是一个更复杂、更不确定的未来。所以，这场冲突究竟为这个世界带来了什么样的改变呢？在一片废墟之中，伊朗迎来了新的最高领袖。
穆杰塔巴·哈米尼。他从他父亲手中接过的不是一个强盛的国家，而是一个在战火里面挣扎求生的烂摊子。
这就带出了一个非常有意思的地缘政治概念，叫做战略悖论。简单来说，意思就是你可能赢了战役，但却输掉了整场战桩。你看，美国和以色列在军事上的确是取得了胜利，甚至还除掉了伊朗的最高领袖，但他们可能没想到，这场战争引发的全球能源危机和区域动荡，反而让自己陷入了更大的困境。同一时间呢，像俄罗斯这样的对手却坐收渔翁之利，而中国则趁这个机会扮演起了稳定局势的关键角色。说到这里，我们真的不禁要问一个问题：单纯依靠这种压倒性的军事力量，真的能换来长久的和平跟稳定吗？或者，这场看起来是胜利的战争，其实只是打开了一个潘多拉的盒子，里面装满了更多的动荡和未知。这个问题可能没有标准答案，但真的值得我们每一个人好好思考。
So I want you to just imagine a scenario for a second. Imagine waking up, making your morning coffee, and, instinctively grabbing your phone to check the news.
Like we all do every single morning.
Right, exactly. But as you're scrolling, you slowly realize that the global security architecture, the global supply chain, and the internet infrastructure have all basically fractured on the exact same day.
Which sounds completely terrifying.
It really is. You try to load a web page and it just times out. You see a headline about a massive cyber blackout, another one about stealth bombers, and a third about marine insurance markets completely freezing up.
Yeah.
And you realize all in the span of one morning that the world you went to sleep in just no longer exists.
I mean, it sounds distinctly like the opening montage of a dystopian novel, right?
Totally.
Like the kind where the protagonist is completely unaware of these massive geopolitical tectonic plates shifting right beneath their feet until the earthquake literally hits their living room.
It does. It really does sound like fiction. But the crazy thing is, that is not fiction. That is exactly what happened in late February 2026.
Yeah.
Today, we're undertaking a massive deep dive into a conflict that absolutely staggered the globe. We're talking about the multi-front Iran-US-Israeli war.
And to reconstruct this, we aren't just looking at one single perspective.
Right.
We are actively cross-referencing this huge stack of material. We've got everything from minute-by-minute Wikipedia conflict timelines to these really granular, geolocated military data drops from ACLEE.
That's the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, for those wondering.
Exactly. They track exactly where munitions land, and we're pairing all of that with geopolitical think tank analyses and real-time financial market reports.
Which is so vital, because if you only look at the military data, you only see the explosions.
Right. You just see the kinetic outputs.
Yeah, exactly. So the mission of this deep dive today is to map out the invisible architecture underneath those explosions. We need to look at the economic incentives, the hidden leverage points within global shipping.
The fatal weaknesses of state networks?
Yes. And the geopolitical shockwaves that fundamentally reshaped your world in the 21st century.
So to start, we really need to unpack the baseline.
Yeah, let's set the stage, because we had this long, simmering Cold War in the Middle East, right?
Mm-hmm.
Decades of proxy fights, gray zone skirmishes, shadow wars out at sea.
Right.
How does a manageable, albeit violent status quo, suddenly just boil over into the largest regional conflict of the century in a matter of days?
Well, to understand the explosion, you really have to look at the structural integrity of the container it was in.
Okay.
Before the first bomb even dropped on February 28th, you had two distinct, highly volatile crises reaching their absolute critical mass at the exact same time.
And those were?
The first was diplomatic and nuclear, and the second was purely domestic and economic.
All right, let's tackle that diplomatic collapse first. When we look at the reports detailing the 2025 and 2026 negotiations between the U.S. and Iran, it reads less like a negotiation and more like a mutual declaration of irreconcilable differences.
Yeah, they were structurally doomed from the start.
Mm-hmm.
You have the U.S., under the Trump administration at the time, drawing this uncompromising hard line.
Right.
Their demand wasn't simply to, pause uranium enrichment or install a few more cameras for the UN inspectors.
Yeah, it was way bigger than that.
The demand was the total physical dismantling of Iran's core nuclear facilities. Specifically, they targeted the underground facilities at Fordo Natanz. They demanded that all enriched uranium be literally handed over to U.S. or Allied custody.
I want to pause on Fordo for a second because the geography there is just crucial to understanding the U.S. demand.
Oh, absolutely.
Fordo isn't just some warehouse on the outskirts of Tehran. It is a facility built deep inside a mountain near the city of Qom. It is heavily fortified specifically to withstand standard aerial bombardment. I mean, the U.S. possesses the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator.
Some bunker buster.
Right, a 30,000-pound bunker buster. But relying on perfectly threading a bomb through hundreds of feet of solid rock is an immense tactical risk.
Yeah, it is.
That physical reality is exactly why the U.S. didn't just want to promise to stop spinning centrifuges, right? They wanted the centrifuges physically dragged out of the mountain and scrapped.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The U.S. military establishment knew that as long as the physical infrastructure existed inside that mountain, a nuclear breakout was always just one political decision away.
Right.
But, to Tehran, physically dismantling their ultimate strategic deterrent is an absolute non-starter.
Obviously.
So Iran countered with a demand that was equally impossible for Washington to fulfill.
Oh, right, the permanent guarantees.
Exactly. Iran demanded permanent, legally binding guarantees that the United States would never withdraw from a nuclear agreement again, regardless of who was occupying the Oval Office in the future.
Which, I mean, any student of American civics knows is a constitutional impossibility.
Right, it just doesn't work that way.
A sitting U.S. president cannot unilaterally bind future administrations to an executive agreement. The only way to make it permanent is a formal treaty.
And that requires a 2/3 supermajority vote in the U.S. Senate.
Which was a political threshold that was entirely out of reach at the time. So you have a situation where the U.S. is demanding the physical surrender of Iran's deterrent, and Iran is demanding an impossible legal fiction.
And this actually leads us to an incredibly important framing point for our entire discussion today.
Yes, I'm glad you brought this up.
When we analyze these irreconcilable demands, the military logic and the devastating fallout, we are looking at this strictly through the lens of strategic cause and effect.
Yeah, and I really want to make that explicitly clear to you listening right now. In this deep dive, we are objectively reporting the stated motivations, the intelligence assessments, and the actions of all the political figures involved, based purely on the source material we have.
Right, we're just looking at the board.
Exactly. We are mapping out how the Trump administration viewed this strike as a necessary security measure and a geopolitical win. We are outlining how Prime Minister Netanyahu leveraged the conflict to eliminate an existential threat while managing, severe domestic electoral pressures.
Yeah.
And we are detailing how the Iranian regime brutally suppressed its own people and weaponized regional proxies to maintain its grip on power.
The key here is impartiality.
Yes. We, as your hosts, are not endorsing any political side's narrative here, nor are we taking a moral or legal stance on the justifications for these strikes under international law.
No.
Our job is simply to show you the chessboard, explain the rules the players were using, and analyze how the pieces moved.
And, well, the most dangerous piece on that board in early 2026 was definitely the nuclear timeline.
For sure.
While the diplomats were just stonewalling each other, the clock was accelerating. By late 2024 and early 2025, the IAEA...
It's UN's nuclear watchdog.
Right. They reported that Iran had stockpiled uranium enriched to near weapons-grade levels.
And we're talking about, what, 83.7% purity?
Exactly, 83.7%, which is just a technical hair's breadth away from the 90% required for an actual nuclear warhead.
Wow.
In the physics of uranium enrichment, getting from 60% to 90% requires vastly less effort and time than getting from natural uranium up to 20%.
And the proliferation network was expanding globally, right? Because the intelligence assessments we reviewed indicate that Iran wasn't just operating in a vacuum.
No, not at all.
They were receiving covert technical assistance from Pakistan and North Korea, specifically regarding ballistic missile reentry vehicles and advanced uranium metallurgy.
Yeah, which changes the game completely.
And the National Council of Resistance of Iran even released reports alleging the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, was developing intercontinental ballistic missiles with a range of 3,000 kilometers.
Which is massive.
It is. That puts major European capitals well within range, fundamentally shifting the threat calculus for NATO.
So for the defense establishments in Israel and the United States, The dashboard is just lit up entirely in red.
Yeah.
The nuclear tipping point is no longer some theoretical debate for a future administration. It is a present tense reality. But, as we noted earlier, the nuclear threat is really only half of the foundation.
Right.
The other half was the extraordinary internal unraveling that was occurring right on the streets of Iran in January 2026.
The protests. And these were not, the isolated, geographically contained protests we've seen in previous years.
No, these were different.
The ACLE data and the human rights reports describe these as the largest, most sustained anti-government protests since the 1979 revolution.
It was huge.
This wasn't just about social grievances anymore. This was driven by total macroeconomic exhaustion. The Iranian rial had completely collapsed, infrastructure was failing, rolling blackouts were just the norm, and the populace had reached a breaking point.
And the state's response, which was orchestrated primarily by the IRGC, was brutally decisive. They didn't just deploy riot police with shields and batons. They deployed paramilitary forces with live ammunition. Yeah. They violently suppressed the protests across multiple major cities. The ACLE casualty data actually points to thousands of civilians killed in the streets over a very, very short period.
Just a massacre.
It was a massacre, and it temporarily cleared the streets. But it utterly shattered whatever remaining domestic legitimacy the regime held.
I look at that situation like the failing economy, the domestic massacres, the nuclear clock just ticking loudly in the background, and I think of it like a structurally compromised pressure cooker.
That's a good way to put it.
The safety valve has been welded shut, but someone is still actively turning up the heat on the burner. A rupture is inevitable.
Right.
So I have to wonder, when the intelligence agencies in Washington and Tel Aviv looked at that internal chaos, did they see a regime too unpredictable to engage with, or did they see like a once-in-a-generation vulnerability?
They absolutely saw a vulnerability. You've hit on the core strategic calculation that really authorized the war.
Okay.
It was a dual incentive. First, obviously, you have Israel's absolute non-negotiable existential fear of an Iranian nuclear breakout.
Sure.
For the Israeli defense establishment, a nuclear-armed Iran is a terminal threat that just must be preempted, period.
Right, but Washington doesn't share that exact same existential proximity. A nuclear Iran is bad for the U.S., obviously, but it doesn't threaten the physical survival of North America. So why did the U.S. administration commit so heavily to a first strike?
Because of the fragility you just described with that pressure cooker analogy. The prevailing theory in Washington, and this is heavily documented in the pre-war think tank analyses and the stated rationales, was that the Iranian regime was so internally fractured.
So hated by its own people.
Yes, so violently hated by its populace after the January massacres, and so economically hollowed out that it simply lacked the institutional resilience to survive a massive kinetic shock.
Oh, I see.
The U.S. military planners genuinely believed that a simultaneous, overwhelming decapitation strike wouldn't just degrade the nuclear program.
It could collapse the regime entirely.
Exactly. They believed the Iranian people would use the chaos of the strike to finish what the January protests had started.
Which brings us to the morning of February 28th, 2026. Because the U.S. and Israel saw this window, they didn't just execute a limited surgical strike.
No.
They didn't just lob a few dozen Tomahawk cruise missiles at a radar installation to send a message. They launched a total simultaneous assault designed to obliterate the brain and the nervous system of the Iranian state in a single night.
Operation Epic Fury, as it was designated by the Pentagon.
And what did the Israelis call their part?
The Israelis dubbed their coordinated component Operation Roaring Lion. And the logistical scale of this opening salvo is just staggering to comprehend.
Tell me about it.
We're talking about the deployment of American B-1 Lancer and B-2 Spirit stealth bombers.
Wow.
And they were flying intercontinental strike missions directly from bases in the continental United States and forward operating bases in Europe. They were executing multiple mid-air refuelings just to maintain absolute radio silence and stealth profiles.
And they were operating in tandem with squadrons of Israeli F-35I Adir stealth fighters, right?
Yes, exactly.
They bypassed early warning radars and hit targets across 30 of Iran's 31 provinces simultaneously.
30 out of 31.
Think about that geographic spread. It wasn't localized to the border. It was a nationwide blanket of precision munitions. And they didn't just hit missile silos and drone factories.
No, they went for the head.
They targeted the absolute pinnacle of the Iranian command structure. They killed the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, in a coordinated strike on his heavily fortified compound.
Yeah.
They eliminated Ali Larijani, a deeply influential political and security figure, along with the highest-ranking commanders of the IRGC.
It was the literal doctrinal definition of a decapitation strike. But, destroying the leadership was really only step one.
Right.
To ensure the regime couldn't project any narrative of survival or control, the bombers also obliterated the government headquarters and the primary national broadcasting centers in Tehran.
They physically silenced the state.
They physically silenced them.
But the physical destruction of the broadcasting centers was just the analog portion of the silencing. The digital portion of this operation is where the nature of modern warfare truly reveals itself.
Oh, absolutely.
The sources describe an accompanying cyber war that is widely classified as the largest, most sophisticated state-sponsored cyber attack in human history.
That's terrifying.
They plunged massive swaths of the Iranian power grid into complete darkness. They bricked the internal communication networks of the IRGC.
And what is really remarkable is how they achieved it. Because Iran had spent years trying to isolate its critical infrastructure from the global internet.
Right, creating their own national information network to prevent exactly this kind of intrusion.
Exactly. But the Israeli and U.S. cyber commands utilized a series of zero-day exploits and highly complex supply chain attacks. They compromised the software updates of the very hardware Iran used to run its own grid.
And the psychological warfare layered on top of the blackout was incredibly invasive. I remember reading this in the source material, and it just gave me chills. The app hack.
Yes. Our sources note that Israeli intelligence managed to hack into the most popular Iranian Islamic prayer apps. Yeah. Imagine you are a civilian in Tehran. The power is out. The ground is literally shaking from bunker busters. The state television is just static. You open your phone to an offline prayer app seeking some kind of comfort, and instead you receive a direct push notification from Israeli intelligence.
Influent Farsi, urging you to defect, to resist the regime, and to immediately evacuate any area near an IRGC facility. It's a masterclass in psychological dislocation. I mean, they took the most private, intimate, digital space a citizen has, their religious practice, and weaponized it to demonstrate that the Iranian state had absolutely zero control over its own territory, physical or digital.
And while the command structure in Tehran is being ripped apart out at sea, the Iranian Navy is being systematically dismantled.
Yeah, the naval theater was wild.
The U.S. Navy, operating under the cover of this massive command and control blackout, sank 17 Iranian warships in the opening 72 hours.
And the geographical reach of this naval hunt is wild. They tracked down and sank an Iranian Kilo-class submarine all the way off the coast of Sri Lanka in the Indian Ocean.
Which is really a testament to the immense capabilities of U.S. anti-submarine warfare.
I can't even imagine tracking something that far out.
Right. Tracking a diesel-electric submarine, which can be incredibly quiet when it's just running on batteries, across the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean requires a massive network.
Sonar buoys, right?
Yeah, sonar buoys, P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, and satellite surveillance. They hunted down every Iranian asset that could potentially threaten global shipping lanes.
But, this total devastation forces us to scrutinize the underlying theory of the strike.
Okay, how so?
Well, the entire premise of Operation Epic Fury was decapitation. The strategic assumption in Washington was that if you cut off the head of a system, the body dies.
Right.
But does that biological analogy actually map onto a deeply institutionalized, fiercely ideological, heavily armed paramilitary organization like the IRGC?
That's the big question.
If you vaporize the central command, does the organization surrender, or do you just remove the central nervous system's restraints, causing the various limbs of that body to thrash around in a much more unpredictable, violent, and decentralized way?
That is the defining question of the conflict. Because history shows us that decapitating a rigid, centralized hierarchy often leads to a temporary paralysis.
Sure.
But the IRGC is not a traditional military. It operates with a really high degree of compartmentalization. When the central command was eliminated, the surviving regional commanders didn't wait around for orders that were never going to come.
Right.
They defaulted to their pre-established decentralized contingency plans. They didn't surrender. They thrashed.
And that thrashing manifested in ways that completely bypassed traditional battlefields. There is a detail in the source material regarding Iran's counterstrikes that illustrates this perfectly.
Oh, the AWS hit.
Yes. While the U.S. is hunting submarines off Sri Lanka and flying stealth bombers, Iran launched a retaliatory drone strike that hit Amazon Web Services AWS data centers located in the United Arab Emirates. Those server farms literally caught fire.
It is a profound, jarring realization of where our true vulnerabilities lie.
It really is. I mean, you listening to this right now, your digital life, your banking, your emails, your company's logistics software, the streaming service playing this very audio is likely routed through an AWS server somewhere.
Almost definitely.
We think of the cloud as this abstract, ethereal thing floating above us, but the cloud is just a massive, heavily air-conditioned warehouse full of metal racks sitting on the ground, often in highly contested geopolitical flashpoints.
Yeah.
A cheap, low-tech suicide drone built in an Iranian garage can fly into a server farm in the desert, and suddenly a logistics company in Europe goes completely offline. Modern war isn't just fought over territory, it's fought over the physical infrastructure of the digital world.
And that strike on the data center perfectly encapsulates the nature of Iran's immediate retaliation. As we discussed, Iran's leadership was decimated. Their sophisticated air defense networks.
Reportedly over 200 defense systems, right?
Yeah, including their advanced Russian-supplied S-300 batteries, they were just wiped out in the first wave. So Iran knew with absolute certainty that it could not win a conventional head-to-head symmetrical war against the combined air and naval supremacy of the United States and Israel.
So they didn't even try.
No.
They realized a symmetric war was suicide, so they pivoted instantly to extreme asymmetric warfare. Their strategic doctrine shifted overnight from deterrence to, if we are going down, we are going to inflict maximum indiscriminate pain on absolutely everyone in our geographic vicinity.
Yeah, they opened up what military analysts term the Ring of Fire.
The Ring of...
They launched a rapid 360-degree retaliation. Let's examine the Israeli front first. The data collected by ACLD recorded over 90 distinct Iranian missile and drone strikes, aimed at Israeli territory in just the first few days following the decapitation strike.
And we need to look at what they were firing and where they were aiming, because that's important. They weren't just aiming at air bases in the Negev desert.
No.
The sources indicate Iran utilized cluster munitions. And for those unfamiliar, a cluster munition isn't just a single explosive. It's a warhead that breaks open midair and scatters dozens, sometimes hundreds, of smaller bomblets over a very wide area.
Like a whole football field.
Exactly. They are notoriously inaccurate and highly lethal to soft targets. Iran aimed these cluster munitions at densely populated residential areas in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem.
Yeah.
The goal was not to achieve a tactical military advantage or destroy a specific radar dish. The goal was psychological terror. It was an attempt to maximize the civilian cost for Israel, to just break the political will of the Israeli public.
But the sheer terror of the escalation didn't stop at the borders of Israel. This is where the strategic paradigm of the entire Middle East completely shattered.
Yay.
For the first time in history, Iran launched direct, kinetic military strikes against all of the Gulf Cooperation Council states simultaneously.
Every single one. Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates.
Yeah.
They targeted the very symbols of Gulf economic prosperity and security. They hit Dubai's international airport, throwing global aviation routing into total chaos. They targeted U.S. embassies and CIA headquarters in Riyadh.
And the desalination plant.
Yes. Perhaps most chillingly, they targeted vital desalination plants in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. If you live in a desert metropolis, a desalination plant isn't just infrastructure. It is your drinking water.
It's survival.
Hitting that is an existential threat to the civilian population.
And when you have hundreds of suicide drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles flying in multiple directions across the narrow confines of the Persian Gulf.
Yeah.
And you have dozens of different air defense systems firing interceptors into that exact same airspace. You create an incredibly dense, chaotic electronic environment. You create the ultimate fog of war.
And in that fog, fatal mistakes happen. We saw a tragic realization of this over Kuwait. In the chaos of the swarm, Kuwaiti air defense operators, staring at radar screens flooded with hundreds of blips, accidentally locked onto and shot down 3 U.S. F-15 fighter jets in a horrific friendly fire incident.
Which really highlights the vulnerability of complex defense networks.
How does that even happen with modern tech?
Well, in a saturated airspace, the IFF systems...
Identification friend or faux transponder?
Exactly. The signal that tells a radar, I am an American jet, do not shoot me. Those can be masked by electronic warfare, or simply lost in the sheer cognitive overload of an operator who has maybe 3 seconds to decide if a radar track is an incoming Iranian cruise missile or an Allied fighter plane.
Man, that is grim. But wait, I need to stop and push back on the broader logic of this Iranian retaliation.
Okay.
I'm looking at the map here. Iran's capital is burning. Their supreme leader is dead. Their navy is at the bottom of the ocean. Why on earth would the surviving IRGC commanders look at that situation and say, you know what we need right now? We need to declare war on 6 of our neighboring countries simultaneously.
It seems crazy.
Doesn't that just invite the militaries of Saudi Arabia and the UAE into the fight against them?
Right.
Isn't lashing out in 360 degrees an act of strategic suicide?
It seems entirely counterintuitive if you view it through the lens of a traditional nation-state trying to win a conventional war.
Okay.
But if you view it through the doctrine of an insurgency trying to survive, there is a brutal, calculated logic to it. It's the doctrine of shared pain.
Shared pain.
Right. First, by hitting the glitzy financial hubs of the Gulf states, Iran is deliberately shattering the illusion of regional security. For years, countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia have invested billions to insulate their economies, presenting themselves as safe havens for global capital, completely distinct from the chaos of the broader Middle East.
Yeah.
Iran's strikes are a message. They're saying, we are the geopolitical gravity of this region. If our economy burns, your luxury hotels, your banking sectors, and your international airports burn with us.
It's the ultimate hostage situation.
Right.
We're all in this together, and I have my finger on the detonator.
Exactly. Secondly, there is a highly technical, tactical motive. By firing simultaneously at Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and U.S. bases in Iraq, Iran is attempting to physically saturate the multi-layered air and missile defense systems across the region.
Oh, I see.
Systems like the U.S. Patriot batteries, which handle lower-tier threats, and the Hayed systems, which handle high-altitude ballistic missiles. They are incredibly advanced, but they have a finite number of interceptor missiles loaded in their tubes.
They can just run out of bullets.
Precisely. If you force the U.S. military to simultaneously defend the skies over Dubai, Riyadh, Doha, and Tel Aviv, you thin out their interceptor inventory rapidly. You force the defense computers to prioritize which city lives and which city takes a hit.
Wow. And the third motive?
Diplomatic leverage. By inflicting acute economic and physical pain on vital U.S. allies in the Gulf, Tehran isn't trying to defeat those Arab states militarily.
You're trying to panic them.
Yes. They hope the leadership in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi will pick up the phone, call Washington, and demand that the U.S. immediately halt its bombing campaign and implement ceasefire just to save their own economies. It's using U.S. allies as human shields to pressure the Pentagon.
Okay, so hitting the neighboring countries was about localized terror and saturating air defenses. But Iran realized that to survive, they needed leverage not just over the region, but over the entire globe.
Right.
They needed to force the international community to intervene. And to do that, they targeted the world's most vulnerable economic artery. And the mechanism they used to shut it down wasn't just high explosives. It was a surprisingly bureaucratic weapon.
You are referring to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
I am. The Strait of Hormuz is the narrow passage of water between Oman and Iran connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. Roughly 20% of the world's total oil supply flows through that tiny choke point.
20%.
If traffic through the strait stops, the global economy immediately shudders.
And how Iran effectively closed this strait is what makes this conflict so uniquely indicative of modern interconnected warfare. To stop the flow of oil, Iran didn't need to mobilize a massive armada.
No.
They didn't need to physically sink every single ultra-large crude carrier trying to pass through the channel. They just needed to trigger what maritime economists and military analysts are calling an insurance cascade.
This mechanism is just fascinating. The Iranian military attacked a handful of commercial tankers using drones and fast attack craft. They dropped a few naval mines into the shipping lanes.
Right, a relatively minor expenditure of military hardware.
But immediately, a group called the Joint War Committee in London, which is essentially a board of marine insurance underwriters that assesses global maritime risk zone, they designate the entire Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz as an extreme risk zone.
Yeah.
Overnight, The war risk premiums that maritime insurance companies charge ship owners to transit that water surge by hundreds of %.
It creates a scenario where traversing the strait becomes legally and financially impossible for commercial shipping.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate here for a second. If this insurance cascade is so globally devastating and the world is absolutely desperate for oil, why wouldn't state-backed shipping fleets just self-insure? Like, why can't a massive state-owned Chinese oil company just say, we don't care what the underwriters in London say, we will cover our own losses, just keep the ships moving? Does a boardroom in London really have veto power over the global energy supply?
It's an excellent question, but it fundamentally misunderstands the interconnected legal firewall of global shipping. It's not just about the value of the ship or the oil inside it, it's about liability.
Okay.
Commercial ships require something called protection and indemnity insurance, or P&I. This covers third-party liabilities, like a massive environmental disaster or a port collision.
Right.
If a ship does not have globally recognized reinsured P&I coverage, sovereign port authorities, whether in Rotterdam, Singapore, or Shanghai, will legally bar that ship from docking.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they won't let an uninsured floating environmental hazard into their waters, because if it sinks in their harbor, the port is liable for billions in cleanup and block traffic.
So it's a domino effect. The risk spikes, the underwriters pull the coverage, the port authorities revoke docking permissions, and the ship owners physically order their captains to drop anchor outside the conflict zone.
Exactly.
The underwriters in London effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz. The missiles just gave them the excuse.
That is exactly how modern supply chain vulnerabilities are weaponized. And what's really fascinating to analyze is the stark contrast between this 2026 conflict and the 1980s.
The tanker war.
Right? During the Iran-Iraq tanker war in the 1980s, hundreds of commercial ships were attacked, set on fire, and sunk over several years. Yet the oil kept flowing.
Ship owners just took the hits.
Yeah, they paid the hazard pay and kept moving because the market was less tightly coupled back then. But in 2026, the global supply chain is so hyper-optimized, so reliant on just-in-time logistics and complex algorithmic reinsurance networks that a very limited, highly targeted military action by Iran triggered a systemic algorithmic commercial collapse.
I think of it like shutting down a major interstate highway. If you want to stop traffic, you don't need the military capacity to blow up every single car on the road.
No.
You just need to blow up 2 cars, film it, and convince the auto insurance companies that driving on that highway is a guaranteed total loss. The actuaries will revoke everyone's coverage and the drivers will just stay home.
It is a brilliant analogy. The physical threat creates an administrative blockade. And the macroeconomic ripple effects of this administrative blockade were immediate and universally devastating.
Global oil prices skyrocketed practically overnight, mimicking the severe energy shocks of the 1970s.
But in our modern economy, an energy shock is an everything shock.
Because everything requires energy to move.
Exactly. And it wasn't just oil. The Persian Gulf region is a massive exporter of urea and ammonia, which are the foundational components of global fertilizer.
Right.
When the ships stopped moving, the fertilizer supply just choked.
Which means the cost to grow crops anywhere in the world goes up. This is how a geopolitical conflict directly and painfully hits the listener's wallet. A suicide drone strikes an oil tanker off the coast of Oman, a maritime insurance premium spikes in a boardroom in London, the cost of fertilizer jumps, and suddenly the cost of a loaf of bread or a gallon of milk in a grocery store in Kansas or Tokyo or Berlin jumps up 20%.
Yeah, it's all connected.
It demonstrates that localizing a war in the 21st century is a total myth. Our vulnerabilities are deeply, terrifyingly connected.
But, while Iran was successfully projecting this asymmetric power outward, disrupting the global economy and terrifying the Gulf states, the intense pressure of the U.S. and Israeli military campaign was causing its internal stability and its prized network of regional proxies to severely fracture.
Let's look inside the borders of Iran first. With Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei assassinated in the opening hours of Operation Epic Fury, the regime faced an immediate succession crisis.
Yeah.
The transfer of power was shockingly fast. His son, Mojtaba Khamenei, who had long been operating behind the scenes, controlling vast financial and security apparatuses, rapidly consolidated power.
He stepped right in.
But the kingdom he inherited was literally on fire and geographically fragmenting.
The internal fragility that the U.S. intelligence community had banked on was actually manifesting, particularly in the peripheral provinces.
Right. We saw a major armed crisis erupt with the Kurdish population in western Iran. Our sources detail a massive event in the city of Mariwan, nestled in the Zagros Mountains, which is a region with a long history of suppression and resistance. There was a massive prison break, thousands of political prisoners and dissidents were freed, which rapidly evolved into a full-scale, heavily armed Kurdish-Iranian insurgency.
And the irony of that situation is incredibly bitter. Iran is fighting an existential war for its very survival against the overwhelming technological superiority of the United States and Israel.
Yeah?
And simultaneously, the IRGC has to divert precious, dwindling military resources, fighter jets, attack helicopters, ground troops, to actively bomb its own peripheral territory just to maintain control over its borders.
It highlights the extreme brittleness of an authoritarian state under pressure. They're fighting a superpower in the sky and an insurgency in their mountains.
Exactly.
But from a geopolitical perspective, perhaps even more surprising than the internal Kurdish rebellion was the reaction of Iran's external shield.
The axis of resistance.
The proxies. This is crucial. For decades, Iran has funneled billions of dollars, trained thousands of fighters, and smuggled advanced weaponry to groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, various militias in Iraq and Syria, and the Houthis in Yemen.
A massive network.
Right. And the entire strategic purpose of this network was to act as a forward defense for Tehran. The implicit deal was, if the homeland in Iran is ever directly attacked, the proxies will immediately unleash hell on Israel and U.S. bases to force a multi-front war.
Yeah.
But when the U.S. bombers actually hit Tehran, that grand proxy strategy completely misfired.
It did. And analyzing why it misfired is essential. Let's look at Hezbollah. They are the crown jewel of Iran's proxy network, boasting tens of thousands of rockets aimed directly at Israel.
Right.
Yet when Operation Epic Fury commenced and the Iranian leadership was decapitated, Hezbollah did not immediately launch a massive barrage. They waited 2 full days before officially entering the conflict.
2 days. I mean, in the context of a hyper-modern, high-tempo air war, 48 hours is an absolute eternity. Why the hesitation? Why didn't they immediately rush to defend their patron?
This phenomenon is what military analysts call the proxy dilemma. The hesitation was born of a cold, rational calculation of self-preservation.
Okay.
Hezbollah was severely degraded from years of prior, targeted Israeli strikes. Their leadership ranks had been thinned out, their communication networks were compromised, and their weapons caches had been systematically hunted.
So they were already weak.
Right. The leadership in Beirut knew with absolute certainty that launching a full-scale war against a fully mobilized Israeli defense force would invite the total, unconstrained destruction of their remaining infrastructure in Lebanon.
It makes complete psychological sense when you put yourself in their shoes. Imagine you listening to this, being a senior Hezbollah commander in Beirut. You have spent your life preparing for this holy war. But now you are being called by ideological duty to enter a devastating conflict against a massively superior Israeli military, knowing full well that your sponsor in Tehran is currently hiding in a bunker, their capital is burning, their supreme leader is dead, and their economy is in ruins.
It's a bad bet.
You are being asked to sacrifice your organization, your soldiers, and your political standing in Lebanon for a patron who can no longer supply you, fund you, or protect you.
Exactly. The ideological bond was tested against the reality of physical annihilation, and the physical reality caused hesitation. And when Hezbollah finally did launch its strikes, the hesitation had cost them the element of surprise.
Yeah, and the result was catastrophic for them.
Yeah.
Israel immediately launched a devastating ground invasion into southern Lebanon to clear the border.
And we saw a similar calculus play out with the Houthis in Yemen, didn't we?
We did. The Houthis demonstrated what intelligence analysts politely termed strategic patience.
Right.
While they made fiery statements of solidarity, they largely held back from fully committing their arsenal of ballistic missiles and drones in the early critical days of the war.
Yeah.
They chose to preserve their own hard-won power and territorial control in Yemen rather than sacrificing it all in a futile gesture for a burning Tehran. When the shield was finally called upon, the proxies were forced to choose between their ideological loyalty to the Iranian regime and their own political and physical survival at home.
And overwhelmingly, self-preservation won out.
So we have mapped out the kinetic devastation of the air campaign, the dystopian reality of the cyber blackout, the economic fallout of the insurance cascade closing the Strait of Hormuz, and the fracturing of the proxy networks.
They've covered a lot of ground.
We have. Now we need to zoom out. We need to look at the global chessboard and examine the geopolitical paradox of this entire conflict. When the dust settles on a war of this magnitude, the ultimate question is, Who actually wins?
And that is the most complex, nuanced question of this entire analysis. Because tactical victories do not necessarily equal strategic victories.
Let's start with the United States.
Okay. Tactically, from a purely military standpoint, the U.S. achieved absolute dominance. Operation Epic Fury achieved its kinetic objectives.
Right.
It severely degraded Iran's nuclear capabilities, destroyed its integrated air defenses, eliminated its top leadership, and sank its navy.
But strategically, economically, it looks like a massive paradox. The U.S. flexed its military muscle to eliminate a threat, but in doing so, it inadvertently triggered a massive global economic crisis through the closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
Exactly.
And politically, the fallout is a nightmare for Washington, both domestically and internationally. Domestically, Congress is pushing back aggressively on presidential war powers, arguing the administration overstepped its constitutional bounds by launching a regime change war without congressional authorization.
And the international diplomatic fallout was even more severe. Washington's closest allies, the nations they rely on to project global power, just balked. When the Trump administration demanded that NATO allies send naval vessels to the Persian Gulf to help run convoys and force open the Strait of Hormuz, many of them flat out refused.
Really?
Yeah. The European capitals looked at the economic devastation, the spikes in their own energy costs, and the unilateral nature of the initial strike, and they effectively said, "You initiated this conflict without our consensus. This is your war, not ours. We will not risk our ships to clean up your strategic miscalculation."
Which brings us to the most fascinating geopolitical winner of this entire conflict.
China.
This is where the tectonic plates of global power truly shift. If you just look at the raw data, China should be the biggest loser of this war.
Totally.
They are incredibly reliant on the Strait of Hormuz, importing roughly 45% of our total oil supply through that single choke point. The war and the subsequent insurance cascade caused a massive immediate energy shock for Beijing, hitting their manufacturing-heavy domestic economy incredibly hard.
Yes. The short-term economic pain for Beijing was very acute. However, strategically and geopolitically, this conflict was arguably the greatest gift Beijing could have asked for.
Explain that mechanism. How does an energy shock turn into a geopolitical win?
It's all about the redirection of American focus and resources. Prior to this war, the entire U.S. strategic doctrine was focused on the pivot to Asia, containing Chinese expansion in the South China Sea and defending Taiwan.
Right, that was the big focus.
But suddenly, the United States is bogged down in the Middle East again. Washington is pouring billions of dollars, vital naval assets, interceptor missiles, and immense political capital into managing a chaotic, multi-front regional war and a global economic crisis.
While China is sitting comfortably on the sidelines.
Precisely. The U.S. is drained, distracted, and alienating its European allies. This vacuum allows Beijing to confidently step onto the world stage and perfectly play the role of the stable, responsible, non-interventionist superpower. They can point to the burning Middle East, the fractured supply chains, and the alienated NATO allies, and say to the rest of the world, look at the chaos and economic ruin Washington causes with its militarism. Now look at the stability, trade, and infrastructure we offer. It accelerates their diplomatic ascendance globally.
And we can't ignore Russia in this equation either. While the West is distracted and China is playing the diplomat, Russia is sitting there counting a massive windfall.
Oh yeah, they made out very well.
The extreme surge in global oil prices caused by the Strait's closure is an absolute economic boon for Moscow, padding their state coffers and funding their own geopolitical ambitions. Plus, every Patriot missile sent to defend Saudi Arabia or Israel, and every ounce of political attention focused on Tehran is attention and resources completely diverted away from Europe and the conflict in Ukraine.
Furthermore, we really must consider the ideological perspective of the global South.
That's a huge piece of this.
For many developing nations in Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia, this war was not viewed through the American lens of a necessary preemptive strike against a rogue nuclear threat.
Right.
It was perceived as a violent return to 19th century imperialist gunboat diplomacy. They saw a Western superpower unilaterally devastating a developing nation and crashing the global economy in the process.
Yeah.
This perception deeply alienated the global South from Washington, pushing many of these nations further into the diplomatic and economic orbit of the BRICS nations led by China and Russia.
So synthesizing all of these moving parts, what does this ultimately mean for the world we live in? Let's recap the sheer terrifying scale of what unfolded in early 2026.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is.
Yeah.
What started as a targeted, technologically supreme decapitation strike against Iran's leadership rapidly metastasized beyond anyone's control. It escalated in a matter of days into a multi-front regional war, dragging in the entire Gulf Cooperation Council. It sparked an internal Kurdish insurgency. It unleashed a historic cyber blackout that weaponized the daily digital lives of citizens. And it triggered a global economic shockwave that shut down the world's most important shipping lane through the cold, bureaucratic mechanism of marine insurance.
It is a stark, unforgiving reminder of the hyper-connected era we live in.
It really is. And this matters to you, the listener, because it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that in the year 2026, raw military might having the best stealth bombers, the most advanced bunker busters, and the most sophisticated submarines cannot shield you from the interconnected vulnerabilities of global trade, digital infrastructure, and marine insurance actuaries sitting in a boardroom in London.
Okay.
The cost of your grocery bill, the price at your gas tank, the stability of your internet connection are all deeply, inextricably tethered to the stability of these distant geopolitical flashpoints. You cannot isolate yourself from a supply chain you rely on to survive.
Which leaves us with one final, deeply provocative question to ponder as we close this analysis.
Okay, what is it?
We watched the United States completely destroy a hostile nation's military apparatus, assassinate its supreme leadership, and achieve absolute tactical dominance in the sky and on the sea. But in doing so, they accidentally crashed the global economy, alienated their closest NATO allies, and handed massive generational geopolitical leverage to their primary rival, China.
Yeah.
If tactical victory results in strategic decline, did the military victory actually matter?
It fundamentally forces us to redefine power. In the 21st century, is the true superpower the nation with the most B-2 stealth bombers in the sky? Or is it the nation that controls the insurance policies, the supply chains, and the physical servers that keep the modern world's lights on?
It's heavy thought.
Think back to the logic of the initial strike. The U.S. and Israel saw a structurally compromised regime. They decided to demolish the building to neutralize the threat inside. They successfully dropped the building.
But they didn't realize until the dust settled that the building's foundation was intimately tied to the load-bearing pillars of the entire global economy.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines and keep looking for the hidden leverage points beneath the surface.
Welcome to The Debate. Imagine wiping out an enemy's entire military infrastructure in just a matter of weeks. Decapitating its leadership, cratering its nuclear ambitions.
Only to realize you've just triggered, the worst global economic crisis in 50 years.
Exactly. That is the exact paradox we are grappling with today. We're looking at the strategic efficacy and, the geopolitical fallout of Operation Epic Fury.
Right, the unprecedented U.S.-Israeli military campaign against the Islamic Republic of Iran that kicked off on February 28, 2026. And it's just a massive shift. I mean, we are no longer talking about proxy skirmishes.
No, not at all.
Or shadow wars, right? This is direct, sustained, kinetic conflict that has entirely reshaped the Middle East.
Yeah, it really has. And drawing directly from, comprehensive geopolitical analyses, military updates, and regional reporting surrounding the conflict, we have to frame the core disagreement here. Has this massive military intervention successfully crippled a dangerous regime by breaking its leadership and its infrastructure?
Or, and this is where it gets complicated, has it triggered a strategic paradox? Basically, failing to force capitulation while simultaneously hardening the regime, regionalizing the conflict, and severely disrupting the global economy.
Right. So, to lay our cards on the table, I'll state my position simply. I argue that the U.S.-Israeli strikes have dealt a terminal structural blow to the Iranian regime's survival.
And I contend that the military action has backfired, forcing the regime into a resilient, asymmetric hardening that actually undermines U.S. global power.
Well, let me outline exactly why I see this as a terminal rupture, because what we are witnessing with Epic Fury is not just another cycle of escalation.
Okay.
For decades, the regime in Tehran relied on this aura of invulnerability. They invested heavily in a nuclear deterrent and a deeply entrenched, opaque leadership structure.
Right.
But by launching precision decapitation strikes that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and key political brokers like Ali Larijani, the coalition, they didn't just take out individuals. They created an unrecoverable crisis of command.
I hear that, but it's...
Wait, let me just add, it's not just about the leadership. It's the systematic, mechanical dismantling of the country's military capabilities. In the opening phase alone, they wiped out roughly 200 air defense systems.
Which is a staggering number, I admit.
It is, and without those systems, the airspace is completely open. They wiped out 17 warships, essentially erasing Iran's conventional naval threat. And because the skies are open, they've been subjecting Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan to continuous bombardment.
Right, the nuclear sites.
Exactly. You simply cannot sustain a functioning state when the physical nuts and bolts apparatus of your security is systematically dismantled from the air. We are already seeing the state crumbling, like most clearly with the Kurdish uprising in the West. When your borders are breaking, your state is broken.
I understand why the sheer scale of the destruction leads you there. I mean, the kinetic pressure is immense. But I think that perspective relies on a fundamentally Western assumption.
Which is? The idea that taking out top personnel and physical infrastructure automatically equals a nation's capitulation. I argue this campaign is a massive strategic miscalculation because the regime hasn't collapsed at all.
You don't think so?
No, it has demonstrated intense institutional resilience. Look at how quickly they adapted. The rapid succession of Mojtaba Khamenei and the immediate consolidation of power by IRGC hardliners, specifically Mohammad Bagher Khalibaf, shows a system that planned for this exact contingency.
They certainly streamlined things.
Right. They haven't folded. They've streamlined decision-making, and you cannot analyze this war in a vacuum. Iran executed an unprecedented retaliation, striking all 6 Gulf Cooperation Council states.
Yeah, we're talking UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, all of them. And by effectively closing the Strait of Hormuz, they haven't just defended themselves, they have triggered the most severe global energy crisis since the 1970s. This intervention didn't neutralize the threat. It accelerated a shift toward a multipolar world that heavily benefits China and Russia.
Okay, you talk about institutional resilience, but let's really dig into what that actually looks like on the ground, starting with the leadership transition.
Sure. You see the rapid elevation of Mojtaba Khamenei as this seamless planned maneuver. I see it as a desperate measure that fundamentally compromises the regime. Think about what Ali Khamenei represented.
He was the ultimate authority, yes.
He held 37 years of highly specific, cultivated religious and historical authority. He was the ideological glue. Removing him is it's like removing the keystone from an ancient arch. But the arch hasn't fallen.
Without that specific religious legitimacy, it cannot hold its own weight. And look at how Mojtaba has actually assumed power. If he's in charge, where is he? He hasn't appeared in public.
Well, they're under constant bombardment.
But his very first message to the nation as the new supreme leader was a written statement read by an anchor on state television while a still photograph of his face was displayed. Does that project strength to a terrified population? To me, it reveals a hollowed-out leadership hiding in bunkers.
Wait, I have to stop you there, because equating a television broadcast with institutional control is a massive leap. It misreads how authority is projected during an existential war.
How so?
You call it a hollowed-out leadership, but Mojtaba's first manifesto was not some plea for survival. It was a massive doubling down.
It was definitely aggressive, I'll give you that.
Very aggressive. In that written statement, he explicitly demanded war reparations. He threatened to open new fronts in areas where the U.S. military lacks recent operational experience. And he explicitly ordered the continued closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
Right, but those are just words read by a news anchor.
It's not a sign of panic, though. It's a signal that the institutional machinery of the state, specifically the IRGC, is throwing its absolute unified weight behind him.
But is it a unified weight, or is it just the IRGC taking the reins because there's literally no one left to stop them?
Well, that's exactly the point. The death of figures like Ali Larijani, who was a more pragmatic conservative, actually removed the constraints on the military.
So they have free rein.
Exactly. It allowed the IRGC's most hardline elements to consolidate power without the usual internal bureaucratic friction that has plagued Iranian politics for decades. They don't need Mojtaba to be a charismatic religious scholar right now.
They just need a figurehead.
They need a wartime rubber stamp for the military apparatus. That is continuity and escalation, not collapse.
But the structural integrity of the regime has always required that balance between the clerical establishment and the Revolutionary Guards. By handing total, unmitigated control to the military, yes, you bypass the messy political infighting, but you also strip away the last veneer of religious legitimacy the state had.
I'm not sure legitimacy matters as much right now.
It has to. The rhetoric of demanding reparations and threatening new fronts, it's performative bravado. It's what a leadership says when they know they can't win a conventional fight and need to project strength to their own terrified ranks.
Historically, though, a wartime footing is exactly when authoritarian regimes are most cohesive. External existential threats forge internal unity.
Cohesive at the top, perhaps, in the bunkers. But how can you possibly maintain that illusion of unity when we look at the streets? Let's talk about the internal fragmentation. Because leadership survival means nothing if you lose control of your own territory.
You're referring to the Kurdish unrest?
Exactly, the 2026 Kurdish-Iranian crisis. This isn't just civil unrest. We have the coalition of political forces of Iranian Kurdistan, the CPFEK, actively coordinating military actions along the western border.
True, they are launching organized assaults.
Right. They aren't just protesting, they are launching tactical assaults. We saw the regime forced to evacuate entire border cities like Mariwan following a massive coordinated jailbreak.
It's a serious, localized threat, yes.
But it represents the whole state's fragility. The domestic security apparatus isn't a solid brick wall right now. It is a glass shield. Yes, relying on sheer brute force to suppress an immediate threat, but a glass shield absorbs kinetic energy by fracturing.
Okay, I see where you're going.
Every time they crack down, they fracture their own foundation. The staggering death toll from their domestic suppression fundamentally shatters the state's internal legitimacy. They are now fighting a two-front war, defending against the most advanced air forces in the world above them while fighting a heavily armed insurgency from their own population.
It's a compelling image, the glass shield. But have you considered how the regime actually utilizes this external conflict to manage that exact internal dissent?
How could they possibly spin losing control of their border towns?
Because strategically, this massive U.S.-Israeli bombing campaign has handed the regime the ultimate pretext to enforce absolute, unquestioned unity. Let's look at the mechanism of how they've weaponized the war domestically.
Okay, let's hear it.
Mojtaba Khamenei stated publicly that in this environment of total war, anyone protesting in the streets is no longer viewed as a civilian dissident.
Right, they were classified as enemy combatants.
Exactly. That effectively gives the internal security forces, specifically the Basij paramilitary, a blank check to use military-grade lethal force without any internal political blowback.
But I'm genuinely stuck on this point. You're assuming the broader population and even the rank-and-file military buys into that narrative.
In a state of total war, fear enforces the narrative.
But reports indicate people in various provinces were literally cheering the death of the supreme leader when the strikes happened. The legitimacy is gone. When the IRGC has to pull elite ground force units away from defending strategic ballistic missile sites just to suppress insurgencies in Kurdistan, they are stretching their physical resources to the breaking point.
They are stretched, absolutely.
A state cannot survive purely on coercion indefinitely, especially when the infrastructure required to project that coercion, bases, communication hubs, command centers, is being dismantled from the air.
But they don't need the general population to buy the narrative. That's the brutal reality of authoritarian survival. They just need the security apparatus to buy it. And they have.
You think the Basij are that unwavering?
We have to understand who the Basij and the IRGC are. They aren't just regular soldiers. Their entire ideological, financial, and social existence is tied to the Islamic Republic. If the regime falls, these men lose everything.
Right, they face tribunals or worse.
Exactly. That creates a level of internal, back-to-the-wall cohesion within the armed forces that is extraordinarily difficult to break simply by dropping bombs on their facilities. And this dynamic, this desperate need to survive at all costs, directly connects to how their internal security feeds into their external power projection.
Which brings us to the global economic fallout, the so-called strategic paradox.
Yes, the strategic paradox. And it is the ultimate irony here. By launching an overwhelming, surgical, kinetic strike to destroy Iran's conventional military, the coalition didn't contain Iran.
No?
No, they accidentally freed Iran to fight the only way they actually can win, by holding the global economy hostage.
I mean, we've definitely seen them lash out.
More than just lash out. Let's look at the mechanics of this retaliation. Iran successfully launched strikes against all 6 GCC states. Precision drone and missile hits on luxury commercial districts in Dubai, oil infrastructure at Ras Qanura in Saudi Arabia, and U.S. bases in Bahrain and Qatar.
True, the scope of the retaliation was unprecedented.
But the real masterstroke, the most devastating maneuver, is the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. It's a choke point, only 21 miles wide.
Right, they flooded it with smart mines.
Smart mines, fast attack craft, and hiding mobile anti-ship missile batteries along the rugged coastline. They have made it impassable for commercial shipping. By disrupting 20% of the world's daily oil supply, Iran has successfully shared the pain of this conflict with the entire globe.
Shared the pain, yes, but to what end?
They have alienated U.S. allies in the Gulf who practically begged Washington not to start this war, and they've caused the most severe energy shock since the 1970s. Oil prices are skyrocketing. This accelerates a geopolitical shift toward a multipolar world, heavily benefiting China and Russia. Meanwhile, the U.S. drains its political capital trying to police an unwinnable blockade.
See, you're entirely ignoring the economic and military reality of sustaining that blockade, though. What you're describing as a masterstroke of asymmetric warfare, I view as the desperate thrashing of a cornered animal.
Closing the strait isn't thrashing. It's highly calculated.
Lashing out at neighboring countries and mining international waters is not a viable long-term strategic doctrine. It is an unsustainable spasm. Let's look at the actual math of their missile forces.
Okay, let's look at the math. Pre-war estimates suggested Iran had a stockpile of roughly 2,500 long-range ballistic missiles. In the opening weeks of this conflict, they are burning through that stockpile at an astonishing rate to overwhelm Patriot and THAAD interceptors.
Because you have to launch swarms to get past them.
Exactly. They are launching hundreds of missiles just to get a handful through to target in the UAE or Saudi Arabia.
But the interceptions aren't perfect. Even a 90% intercept rate means 10% of those warheads hit critical energy infrastructure.
That's true. And the economic damage is done the moment the airspace and shipping lanes are contested. You don't have to sink a dozen oil tankers to close the strait. You just have to hit one. And the insurance companies will refuse to underwrite any vessel entering the Persian Gulf. The shipping halts immediately.
True. The immediate shock is severe. But look at the supply side. Iran cannot replace these weapons. They can't replace the anti-ship missiles or the drones because U.S. bombers, specifically the stealth B-2s, are systematically destroying their launch sites.
Well, they're hitting known facilities, sure.
They're hitting underground production facilities and hardened storage depots. You cannot fight a war of attrition when your capacity to produce and deploy weapons is literally being erased.
Underground facilities are notoriously hard to destroy, though.
If you're wondering how a few bombers stop a deeply entrenched missile program, we have to look at the munitions. The B-2s are dropping GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators.
The bunker busters.
Yeah, these are 30,000-pound bunker busters. They are designed to penetrate up to 200 feet of reinforced concrete and mountain rock before detonating. They are structurally collapsing the very subterranean networks Iran thought were impenetrable. Fordo, Natanz, the missile cities buried under the Zagros Mountains.
Right.
So yes, Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz today. But they simply do not have the logistical endurance, the surviving hardware, or the manufacturing base to sustain this pressure over the months required to actually break the U.S. coalition. It is a terrifying thrashing, absolutely, but it is the thrashing of an entity that is rapidly bleeding out.
You are focusing purely on the degradation of Iranian hardware, but you are completely ignoring the degradation of Western political and economic will.
I don't think I'm ignoring it.
You mentioned the B-2 bombers and the bunker busters, and yes, they are highly effective munitions for collapsing a mountain. But every single day that the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, the global economy hemorrhages.
It hurts, definitely.
Investor confidence is plummeting. War risk surcharges for global shipping have skyrocketed, and inflation is threatening to spiral completely out of control globally.
But that's a temporary shock.
The United States and its European allies are highly sensitive to economic shocks. Democratic governments have to answer to voters who are suddenly paying exorbitant prices for energy and basic goods. Iran knows this. The IRGC doesn't need to win a conventional military victory against the United States Navy.
No, obviously not.
They don't need to outproduce U.S. munitions. They just need to impose a high enough economic cost that the political consensus in Washington, London, and Paris fractures.
I see your point.
Furthermore, by striking the GCC states, Iran has completely dismantled the illusion of the U.S. security umbrella. For decades, Gulf nations hosted U.S. bases, believing it guaranteed their safety. Now they are realizing that hosting U.S. assets makes them targets, not protected partners. That fundamentally rewrites the security architecture of the Middle East against long-term U.S. interests.
I hear that, but I think you are vastly underestimating the resolve that this specific conflict has forged in the West.
Really? You think voters will just accept the inflation?
Yes, there is immediate economic pain, but the sheer scale of Iran's aggression, attacking all 6 GCC states, hitting civilian infrastructure, indiscriminately mining international waters, it has actually clarified the absolute necessity of Operation Epic Fury.
You think it justified the strike in hindsight?
It has proven exactly why a regime with this apocalyptic ideology and these disruptive capabilities could never, ever be allowed to maintain a nuclear threshold status. The U.S. and Israel, and quietly many of the Gulf states, are absorbing this economic shock because the alternative was deemed far worse.
Living under a nuclear-armed IRGC?
Exactly. Living under the perpetual blackmail of a nuclear-armed IRGC capable of holding the global economy hostage anytime they want. They're willing to pay the price now to dismantle the threat permanently.
But the economic shock isn't just a temporary dip that voters will politely absorb. It's a structural realignment of global power. By forcing the U.S. to pour billions into a new Middle Eastern war while simultaneously choking energy supplies, Beijing and Moscow are the true beneficiaries.
They're certainly watching closely.
They are sitting back watching the U.S. deplete its advanced interceptor stockpiles, strain its naval assets, and alienate regional partners who were begging for de-escalation prior to February 28. That is the very definition of a strategic paradox. You can win the tactical bombing campaign, you can turn every mountain facility to rubble, but you lose the broader global geopolitical board.
Well, it essentially becomes a grim ticking clock. We will have to see which breaks first: the economic and political will of the Western coalition, or the physical capacity of the IRGC to continue operating while under total, relentless air dominance.
Yeah, it really is a race against time for both sides.
Let's pull back and summarize our positions in light of this deep dive. My stance remains that the sheer kinetic force of the U.S.-Israeli strikes has irreparably broken the Islamic Republic.
And I still disagree.
Fair enough. But by decapitating its historical religious leadership, annihilating its air defenses and naval capacity, and systematically burying its nuclear and missile infrastructure under massive bunker-busting munitions, the coalition has dealt a fatal structural blow. The resulting internal insurgencies, particularly in Kurdistan, aren't just protests. They are the fatal symptoms of a state that can no longer maintain its monopoly on force within its own borders.
And my summary is that this military campaign has yielded a strategic disaster of historic proportions. Rather than collapsing the regime, it has forged a more ruthless, streamlined Iranian leadership under the absolute control of the IRGC.
Which you argue is more effective.
Yes. By successfully regionalizing the conflict, striking the Gulf states, and crippling global energy markets through the ongoing closure of the Strait of Hormuz, Iran has proven that asymmetric warfare can effectively counter conventional high-tech superiority. The U.S. coalition may own the skies, but it is actively losing the broader economic and geopolitical war.
Well, despite our stark differences on what the ultimate outcome will be, I think we both clearly converge on one profound reality.
Which is?
This conflict has permanently erased the gray zone rules of engagement that governed the Middle East for the last 2 decades. The era of shadow wars, proxy skirmishes in third countries, and plausible deniability is entirely over.
Oh, I agree completely. The threshold has been crossed, and there is absolutely no putting the genie back in the bottle. Both the military degradation of Iran and the staggering geopolitical and economic blowback against the United States will shape international relations for a generation.
Yeah, it's unprecedented.
The old playbook is burning, and there is so much more to explore in the historical record of these events as the data continues to come in from the region.
Absolutely. And it brings us right back to our opening thought. We are watching the immediate aftermath of a massive seismic event. The true outcome of this war depends entirely on whether the internal brittleness of the Iranian regime causes the state structure to shatter completely under the bombardment, or whether the global economic pain of the earthquake forces the U.S. coalition to back down first.
Precisely. The foundation is fractured, and the world is holding its breath to see what falls. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.